Hello, I'm happy to welcome you to the 2020 Annual Legislative Conference. My name is Naomi Smith, and I'm the Research Policy Analyst with the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. This session, Financial Independence and Black Wealth Creation, has been presented to you by our sponsor, Prudential Financial. To kick off our session, I would like to introduce Congressman Gregory Meeks. Congressman Gregory Meeks is now in his 11th term and has devoted his energy and skill to serving one of the most diverse constituencies in the nation. His efforts on behalf of his district, New York City and state, and the nation as a whole has earned Representative Meeks the respect of his constituents, New Yorkers, and Democrats and Republicans alike. Congressman Meeks is a senior member of the House Financial Services Committee, where he serves as the chairman of the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Financial Institutions, which oversee all of the financial regulators such as FDIC, Federal Reserves, in all matters pertaining to consumer credit and the stability of the banking system. Representative Meeks previously served as a Dodd-Frank conferee, key provisions in the Wall Street Reform Law, including its stress testing requirements, the creation of the Office of Minority and Women Inclusion at the financial regulatory agencies, and the requirement that U.S. public companies who use natural resources to report their due diligence in stamping out conflict materials were authored by Congressman Meeks and remain in law today. Congressman Meeks is also a senior member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where he serves as an influential member on both the Subcommittee on Europe, Eurasia, Energy, and the Environment, and the Subcommittee on Western Hemisphere Civilian Security and Trade. He also serves as the CBC co-chair of the Economic Development and Wealth Creation Task Force. Thank you, Congressman Meeks.
Before I begin, I want to thank all of the panelists for participating in today's discussion on financial independence and Black wealth creation. I want to thank the staff of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation for all of the excellent work done to ensure that this important annual conference move forward and be a tremendous success, despite the unique challenges of COVID-19 pandemic. Over the years, the CBC ALC has grown by leaps and bounds in terms of the scope of issues covered, the substance of panel discussions, and the social policy impact and reach of the conference. I am proud to see this continue this year, and I've been fully amazed by the quality of the work and production of this year's fully virtual conference. I'm truly honored to join you for this important discussion on financial independence and Black wealth creation. I can't stress enough how critical this issue is and how urgent it is for us as a community to make important strides forward. Even before COVID, financial insecurity was growing in America, and a very large share of American families were struggling to make ends meet. Circumstances in the Black community were even worse, as the community had yet to fully recover from the 2008 financial crises, which hit Black homeowners especially hard. Indeed, Black families' median income worth is less than 15% of white families, and Black home ownership rate has seen the most dramatic drop of any racial or ethnic group since 2001. Black home ownership is back to levels not seen since the 1960s civil rights movement. COVID has laid bare the structural inequalities and systemic discrimination of the American economy. This has been compounded by the nearly double and daily evidence of police and social brutality against the Black community. It is well past time for us as a nation to tackle the structural inequalities that hold communities of color back. Doing so means tackling all of it at the same time with bold, ambitious plans across all areas of the economy, including education, healthcare, infrastructure, and financial inclusion. This means dismantling the legacy of redlining and continued financial discrimination. For context, my office conducted a study of Queens where we mapped the location of every bank branch against population demographics and income in every zip code of Queens. The findings, which I published in an op-ed in American Banker, found that zip codes with predominantly Black and Hispanic populations have 7 times fewer bank branches than predominantly white zip codes, and many have no branches at all. And this is true even when adjusted for income, as high-income Black and Hispanic zip codes also have far fewer bank branches than non-minority low-income zip codes. This is the legacy of redlining that echoes to this day and perpetuates disinvestment in our communities and stifles home ownership, entrepreneurship, and wealth creation. I'm proud to have introduced and led key legislation that advocated bold ideas in the area of financial services. This includes a bill for transparent and granular reporting on racial and gender diversity of boards and senior executives for all companies listed on the stock exchanges. Addressing discrimination and exclusion starts with access to granular data. I also authored the most ambitious bill to support, strengthen, and ensure access to capital and deposits for the nation's minority banks. Minority banks overwhelmingly serve underbanked and marginalized minority communities and ensure access to mortgages, loans, and financial services to these communities, which far too often live in banking deserts and are forced to rely on predatory actors like payday lenders, check cashing stores, and pawn shops. Finally, I was proud to work with Senators Warner, Schumer, Harris, and Booker, as well as my chairwoman, Maxine Waters, to introduce the most ambitious legislation, I believe, in a generation to support community development financial institutions. These banks, non-bank lenders, and investment funds meet a high bar for community development work and have a key role to play in ensuring an equitable and balanced recovery from the nation's economic crises. Investing in CDFIs and strengthening the overall CDFI infrastructure nationally is the best investment we can make today, as these institutions crowd in capital and invest in the most impacted vulnerable communities. They have a positive multiplier effect and allow communities to build wealth and financial resilience. This pandemic poses the greatest financial challenge for our nation since the financial crisis. We must tackle this health and economic crisis with bold initiatives before this is yet another period in American history where crises led to the enrichment of the privileged few and generational setbacks for communities of color. Count me among those advocating and pushing forward bold solutions to redress the legacy of structural discrimination and lay the foundation for the communities of color to achieve financial independence and accrue the wealth they absolutely can, if they are given a fair chance to do so, and if the never-ending list of obstacles in their way are removed. I close by saying this is the time that we must rent the car and own the house. Why? The car is a depreciating asset. The home is an appreciating asset that help us develop wealth. Let's do it. Let's regain our wealth and let us move forward. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Congressman Meeks. That was really helpful, and I can't wait to hear how this panel will talk about solutions to tackle so many of these structural inequities. Now I will introduce Dr. Mena Demese, who will moderate today's session. Dr. Demese is the Vice President of the Center for Policy Analysis and Research and the Leadership Institute at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. She leads the foundation's research and policy initiatives that affect African Americans and the global Black community in the areas including education, criminal justice, economic opportunity, voting, and environmental sustainability, among so many others. In her capacity, Dr. Demese has spearheaded several partnerships with the White House, Congress, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and other nonprofit stakeholders to advance strategic efforts to influence and inform public policy. She is the founder and co-managing editor of the CBCF's Journal of the Center for Policy Analysis and Research, a multidisciplinary peer-reviewed journal on public policy issues related to Black politics in the United States and abroad. She received her joint PhD in political science and public policy from the University of Michigan and earned a Bachelor's of Arts in economics and law and society with honors from Oberlin College. Thank you, Dr. Demese.
Thank you, Naomi. I didn't realize you were going to read all of that, but thank you. And thank you to Congressman Meeks and our distinguished panel today. So welcome, everybody. You are tuning into financial independence and Black wealth creation. I want to start by thanking Prudential Financial and Celine Hitchcock-Gear, who is the president of Prudential Individual Life Insurance. We are really here today to really engage in some critical discussions around important policy decisions that we need to make regarding financial independence and Black wealth creation. Many have termed this year, 2020, as sort of the year of the unknown, exciting to some, perhaps more scary to others, as we wrestle through this global pandemic that is literally costing us our lives. At the same time, what we know all too well in the Black community is that we have long faced the double pandemic of disproportionately high rates of infection and disease, at the same time that we are disproportionately challenged by our pocketbooks, by our financial health and wealth. And so our expert panelists you will hear from today will shed light on how to understand the economic impact of the current moment and what policies, initiatives, and steps our policymakers can make, our financial institutions can take, and what the broader community at large can do to better address their financial needs. We also want to talk today about Black wealth creation and really discuss the pathways for sustainable financial independence and what strategies can be taken at this current moment. So with that, I am your moderator today, and I will introduce our panelists. You'll hear from each of them, and then we will have a dialogue about what to do to address this current economic situation that we are in. So with that, I want to introduce to you our distinguished panelists for today: Celine Hitchcock-Gear, President of Prudential Individual Life Insurance; Ericka Taylor, Population Education Manager with Take on Wall Street; Professor Darrick Hamilton, University Professor and Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy at the New School. He's also the founding director of the newly created Institute for the Study of Race, Stratification, and Political Economy. We are also joined by Dr. Julianne Malveaux, labor economist and president and founder of Economic Education. And last but not least, Natalie Cofield, founder and CEO of Walker's Legacy. I'd now like to introduce to you Celine Hitchcock-Gear, president of Prudential Individual Life Insurance, a business unit of Prudential that offers competitive solutions to meet the needs of consumers through the manufacturing and distribution of a diverse portfolio of life insurance products. An insurance industry veteran with more than 30 years of experience, Hitchcock-Gear joined Prudential in 2017 as Chief Operating Officer of Prudential Advisors, the company's national sales organization with more than 3,000 financial professionals, advisors, and fee-based financial planners who offer clients a broad range of financial solutions. She was appointed president of both businesses in 2018. Previously, Hitchcock-Gear served as president and CEO of Emeritus Investment Corporation and president and CEO of Acacia Life Insurance Company. She represents Prudential as the director on the Women's Presidents Organization's advisory board as well, and serves on the board of trustees of the American College of Financial Services. Let me turn it over to President Hitchcock-Gear.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm so pleased to be with you all today. I think Congressman Meeks really set the table quite nicely. You know, as we have our conversation today, Prudential is part of this program as a financial services company, but we have a much broader narrative around the work that we do and how we think about the issues that were presented. And we certainly would start with the idea that this is a broad-based set of concerns, and there isn't a silver bullet. We certainly do not see our particular products and services at the individual level, for example, really being the nature of what we might see as real change that's needed to really close this racial wealth gap. But we do believe it's an important contribution. So as we think about all of the elements of the issues that we face, we certainly want to acknowledge and reinforce what Congressman Meeks really was speaking to about the systemic causes of where we find ourselves today. And, you know, we could drown ourselves in a lot of statistics that our feelings about what we're talking about would be very deep. And we don't want to spend a lot of time and over-index on the problem, but I do just want to highlight a few things that are critically important just from a numeric standpoint, so that when we talk about solutions, we have a base from which we can all agree that the urgency is really required, and the measure of our response, therefore, needs to be that urgent around the issues. First thing is, you know, whether you want to go back to Jim Crow or any of the civil rights era challenges, redlining, not being part of the GI Bill, all the things that were put in motion in America that helped others do well. As Black Americans were excluded from much of that, we now see a place where, as was mentioned, we're somewhere in the 10 to 15% range of wealth compared to white Americans. That did not happen overnight. That happened over a period of systemic issues that really put significant barriers in front of people. So while we might believe that there are individual things that we can do, there's no level of individual achievement that deals with those issues. We all have to work in such a way that the policy level matters are really addressed, along with helping people currently today deal with what's in front of them. So at a policy level, Prudential really looks at this at a variety of ways. One is, as a very proud citizen of the community of Newark, over 145 years of being a corporate citizen there, we've just invested nearly $430 million in the community during the time that we've been there from our $1 billion impact fund. That means working with community partners, real estate managers, the neighboring universities and others to really work through community partnership to deal with unemployment, health issues, and a much broader set of issues than just we might do as a financial services company. The other thing is that we do pay attention to and work with legislators and other policy groups around things like helping small business owners band together to get group benefits. So things like multi-employer plans, which might be helpful to small employers to actually offer savings and benefit plans to their employees would be important, and supporting family leave and the kinds of things that help people who are employed have a chance, right, to take the time that they need with family and medical issues. So Prudential would think of itself as a strong contributor to many of those causes. As an employer, we think about how we offer employment to people, from having both career development along with strong wages, but also benefits that help people build their own financial stability. We have startling statistics that tell us all the time how people are challenged with day-to-day matters. And one of the most often quoted number now is we know most Americans, and certainly a large degree of our Black and brown populations, cannot put their hands on $500 for an emergency, a home repair, a medical illness. Those are not the kinds of things that you would say to yourself, well, what does a financial services company do about that? We feel there are things we can do about that, whether it's helping to create simple savings vehicles for folks, or to think about our outreach in our programs that we have with our employers, our group and retirement benefits providers, for example, that offer educational seminars that might help people think about how to approach some of these issues as they occur. Those are really places where we believe, through both education, outreach, and support from the broad network of services that we can provide, would be helpful. We also know, with the sense of urgency, that this racial wealth gap that we talk about today will actually get to zero. So while we say numbers like, and you can count in a lot of different ways, 15 or 17% level of wealth compared to the large numbers for white Americans, that will go to zero, meaning that Black Americans will have zero wealth in 30 years if this trend is left unchecked. So the urgency around this, and the notions that from the 2008 recession to the COVID crisis today, which we know is causing 2.5 times the rate of death in the Black and brown communities, it's not an issue to put off to tomorrow. The idea that we would be having a conversation today about Black wealth creation in the midst of a pandemic and all the political issues we find ourselves in might seem a little out of step with the day-to-day measures that people have to deal with around this trauma. But it is of urgent importance that we all understand what we are facing, and that we need to work together now to actually see some change occur in the future. So a few things that Prudential is doing specifically in this realm. One of them is internally, as an employer. We've had a number of different conversations over this past year about both how to help our associates with the pandemic and deal with these racial injustice issues. But we are taking a hard look at our own talent parameters, how we are thinking about pay, support, benefits, career mobility, et cetera. That is an easy place for many people to start, but for us, we believe that, doing your homework at home first really matters. So making sure that we are in a good place as an employer is very important. And recently with the COVID-19 pandemic and so many of our colleagues now working remotely, we have extended our employment view to disconnect largely from geographic locations, which will let us recruit and develop talent in a very different way. When we can reach nationally versus than just locally, our talent pipeline and pool will grow. And we think that will create some significant opportunities for us to continue to improve on areas of diversity and inclusion around our own organization. The other thing that we are working through is how do we use our business power and impact to address some of these issues. So as we talk about being a strong citizen in Newark and really leaning into these community public-private partnerships, we are looking at other locations around the country, specifically Atlanta and Detroit, to also take our strong collection of business impact, social and community partnerships, and other resources to actually work in those particular cities to see what benefits we can pull together for everyone. One of the things that we know on the plus side of all of this is that, Black consumers are a $1.3 trillion force in America. And unless we pay attention to this as a continuum, meaning we need to work through both policy and broader community context through helping people create and develop individual, family, and generational wealth, we will miss a huge opportunity to not just help people and communities grow, but to look at ways to grow our business. So from a business measure and business impact standpoint, we really believe that starting locally and helping in places where we know we can provide a foundation of support and education will lead to being able to put the right tools in people's hands, small businesses and individuals, to help along the way. Again, not the silver bullet and not the solution, but certainly part of a program that helps people think about their current circumstance and how they can do better with what they have, and think forward with how to think about community and family in ways where certain products and services may be things they hadn't considered as tools and resources for them to be able to take the next step and help with the simple things that are in front of them today and feel less stress about them. One of the umbrella concepts that we have within Prudential is financial wellness, and at the heart of that, it is to help put tools in people's hands that take the stress out of money matters and help people get their arms around what is possible. And some of that just starts with knowing what to do. So we are really, really happy to be part of a conversation that is taking the broad brush and understanding that it will take all of us and our particular expertise to contribute to better outcomes, and certainly want to continue to lend our voice to the policy and social conversations that are so critical, but also do our part in bringing forward the kind of financial solutions that can make a difference for individuals.
Thank you, Celine. Really appreciate those comments. And I want to come back to you later in the conversation around what Prudential is doing with the $430 million investment with community partnerships and to really lift that up as a model for other institutions to take on. I'd now like to introduce Ericka Taylor, Popular Education Manager with Take on Wall Street. Recently, she served as co-director of DC Working Families Party, a state chapter of the national organization working to build progressive political power in communities across the country. Ms. Taylor has spent the bulk of her career in organizing and advocacy, including positions with Organizing Neighborhood Equity DC, DC Acorn, and Tenants and Workers Support Committee. She has also worked as a program officer with the Public Welfare Foundation and trained young people and youth organizers as the Southeast Regional Program Coordinator for Youth Action. She has been a stalwart and strong advocate of financial reform. I'd now like to turn it over to Ms. Ericka Taylor.
Thank you for that introduction, and thanks to all my esteemed panelists and to the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation for the invitation, and of course to Prudential Financial for the sponsorship of this. So when we go over the stats about where Black wealth is in this country, things look pretty bleak. Black people had 0.5% of the nation's wealth in 1865 at the end of the Civil War, and now, more than 150 years later, Black wealth has yet to hit 2%, even though our percentage of the population is roughly the same. Between 1983 and 2016, white wealth grew substantially. Latinx wealth grew a little, and Black wealth actually decreased by over $3,700. the dismal statistics go on, but there's a really important thing that I want to note. We didn't get here through sheer luck, as Congressman member Meeks noted, and Celine Hitchcock-Gear did before me, that these are all the results of systemic challenges, right? So Black wealth is where it is today because of literally hundreds of years of Black wealth extraction. And that's what I really want to focus on this morning. I want to go into to dig in a little more deeply on exactly some of the ways we got here. So I'd like to start with a few examples of what this looked like in the 1800s. So it seems fitting to begin with the foundational wealth extraction of this nation, which is, of course, the 1.5 billion acres of land stolen from indigenous peoples and the labor stolen from 4 million enslaved peoples. It's important to remember that this theft also created wealth. So there's the quote unquote worth of enslaved people, which in 1865 was valued at $3 billion. And that was more than the market value of banks, railroads, and factories combined. And it represented nearly half of Southern wealth. Now, that wealth wasn't confined to the South by any means. So Manhattan actually became the financial center that it is today because roughly 40 cents of every dollar made from cotton went to financing, insuring, and shipping enslaved human beings. Moses Taylor, for example, who founded what would become Citibank, didn't just make his money in the slave trade, he made it in the illegal slave trade. And then on the other side, the paltry compensation for enslavement, the 40 acres and a mule promised by General Sherman, was smacked down by President Andrew Johnson. So, but in the meantime, while we have all this wealth being extracted, the Homestead Act of 1862 allowed people to claim up to 160 acres of public land for a nominal filing fee of just a few dollars. And by public, of course, I mean land that had just been ripped from sovereign nations. So while freed enslaved people were denied 40 acres and a mule, over 1.5 million white families, native born and immigrant, ended up with 270 million 270 million acres of essentially free land that could be passed down generation after generation, creating white generational wealth. In 2000, it was estimated that nearly 46 million people in the US were descended from homesteaders. So now let's jump ahead to the 20th century when the New Deal came around. Now surely, Black wealth creation would be supported over 70 years after the end of the Civil War. Alas, agricultural and domestic workers who were predominantly Black and brown were exempted from both the federal minimum wage and Social Security benefits. So as a result, 27% of white people were ineligible for Social Security, but 65% of Black people were. Around the same time, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, a government entity, helped more than 1 million homeowners with mortgages. That was a $3.5 billion investment, and that played a huge role in creating the white middle class who suddenly had assets with which they could get a loan for a new business or send a kid to college. Less than 1% of those loans went to Black people. So what Black people got was redlining, what HOLC is credited with creating. So as a final example of wealth extraction, we'll jump back in time just a little to 1921. And that's the point at which the Black community in Greenwood and Tulsa had established 600 businesses, 21 churches, 21 restaurants, 30 grocery stores, 2 movie theaters, 6 private airplanes, plus a hospital, a bank, a post office, schools, libraries, law offices, and as a local flyer advertised, even a bus system. Then in the early mornings of hours of June 21st, white rioters burned 35 city blocks and 1,256 residences, destroying what had been known as the Negro Wall Street of America. Sadly, I could exhaust all my time and that of my fellow panelists with dozens more examples of Black wealth extraction. Instead, I'd like to close with what we can do to counter the above. One, I think it's really important to remember that some of this extraction is the result of racist practices, but most of it is based on racist policies. So those of us who have the right to vote, and too many Black Americans don't, must exercise it from the local level on up, because we need people in office at every level to be fighting for policies that will support, not undermine Black people. Two, we need to make sure that the policymakers who are elected vote for policies that contribute to Black wealth. And that means tracking the COVID bills, for example, and making sure they're designed to benefit everyday people and not just the Wall Street elite. And three, we need to hold institutions that benefited from the theft of Black wealth, especially when that wealth was in the form of our very bodies, accountable, and we need to have them make amends. Just recently, Angela Glover Blackwell, the founder of PolicyLink, and Michael McAfee, their CEO, suggested that banks take the following steps. Cancel consumer debt for Black customers. Eliminate banking fees for Black customers. Provide interest-free mortgages for Black home buyers. Provide interest-free loans to Black-owned businesses. Now that won't be nearly enough to compensate for centuries of wealth extraction, but it's a start, and that's something, and those are just a few of the things we can look at. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You are getting an applause from our panel, and appreciate your insight of sharing really the historical context that has brought us to current day. So thank you for that overview. I'd now like to introduce to you Natalie Cofield, founder and CEO of Walker's Legacy. Natalie Cofield founded Walker's Legacy, an organization she created to inspire, equip, and empower professional and enterprising women. She began her career working 3 jobs in high school. She started her first company at 26, and then she grew to become a 3-time CEO by age 30. A millennial that found inspiration at the nexus of business, community, and politics, Ms. Cofield has carved a niche for herself as a serial entrepreneur, advocate, and speaker on all things startup and diversity. As an advocate, she has served as the youngest person to testify before the U.S. Senate Committee on Small Business and Entrepreneurship, and authored The Pursuit of Entrepreneurship, a guide for African-American entrepreneurs. Her work has been featured on CNN, New York Times, Fast Company, Forbes, Business Insider, Black Enterprise, Essence, and Ebony, among others. In 2013, she was named the Technology Diversity Evangelist of the Year by Google and one of the top 10 Black innovators by MVM T50, an initiative of South by Southwest. In 2015, Ms. Cofield was named one of the 100 most influential African Americans in America by The Root 100. And she currently is doing amazing work, really carrying the legacy of Madam C.J. Walker through her leadership, encouraging, supporting, and investing in Black women businesses. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Ms. Natalie Cofield.
Thank you so much, Mena, and to the CBCF for hosting today's conversation along with Prudential to talk about Black wealth. As you heard from Mena in my introduction, I'm the founder of Walker's Legacy, which is a national organization to empower multicultural women. Why is that important as it relates to conversing about Black wealth, particularly within the Black community? The power of the Black woman is so prevalent and prominent. Specifically, when it comes to Black-led households, 80% of them are led by a primary breadwinning Black woman. And so to empower the Black woman financially is to empower the Black community. Furthermore, when we look at Black wealth, particularly as it relates to entrepreneurship, what we also see is that Black women over-index in entrepreneurial activity and in entrepreneurial production. Black women are the only community of women that over-index against any of their male contemporaries. More so, what we see is that nearly 60% of Black businesses are started and run by a Black woman in present day. So it is no longer possible for us to have a conversation about Black entrepreneurship and not start that conversation with the Black woman. This is not about putting the color red or pink on something and creating a secondary initiative. It's about really undergirding and fortifying what is the nation's fastest growing entrepreneurial segment, and that is Black women. When we look at what this means more specifically, Black women across the US are starting businesses at 6 times the national average. And when we look more specifically at the general pool of nearly 10 million firms in the US that are owned by women, of that, 40% are owned by women of color, started and run and owned by women of color. And of that 40%, Black women represent 40% of that subset. So again, 40% of all women of color owned firms in the US are started and run by a Black woman. So we are just continuing to see how much the Black woman is showing her strength as an economic powerhouse for our community, and as well as showing her appetite and her strength for entrepreneurship, and seeing that as what we consider to be a pathway out of poverty. And so for us, it is really also about creating gender parity as it relates to the gross receipts, access to capital that exists for women firms and for Black women firms specifically. I want to make note that when we look at Black male businesses, we see average gross receipts of nearly $100,000. When we see Black women-owned firms, despite the fact that they represent nearly 60% of the Black business community at this stage for new businesses being started, we're still only at the 30%, $30,000 average gross receipts amount, which gives us a chasm of about $70,000 in difference between our male contemporaries. And so again, I say, for us as a community to rise, we need to also be rising in parity as it relates to the equity of access afforded to all of our community, inclusive of our women. And that's particularly significant and needed for the African American community, where Black women are so dominant in certain spaces. I also want to note that among all of the businesses nationally owned, Black women have average receipts, as I mentioned, of about $28,000. I mentioned against Black male companies, but compared to all businesses, we're looking at nearly $768,000 for those owned by white men. So Black women only have, the latter part of their 726,000. Black women are receiving the 28,000 on their average receipts, and we have to continue to do more. This also evidences itself when we start to look at wage parity. So one of the things that we did when we looked at our Black Women Equal Pay Day, which was celebrated in August, was also start to, through our fast fact sheet, produce reports that showed us that beginning around the age of 16, you start to see that Black women's access and Black teens, okay, let's also make sure that we give our young people their proper titling. Black teens and children start to receive less wages than their male counterparts in their teens. We also saw from research that we did on Black women entrepreneurs that Black women have participated in the U.S. labor force at higher rates than any other community of women since the days that we were allowed to actually be counted as laboring, okay, on the census. And so what does that mean? That also means that Black women have continuously and consistently had side hustles. But even today, we see that we have a wage gap of nearly $150 between us, and this is a weekly wage gap between Black women and our white female counterparts. So much so that it impacts what our average net worth is. The average net worth for a single white woman is about $41,000. The average net worth for a single Black woman is about $100. I'll say that again. The average net worth for a single white woman is about $41,000. The average net worth for a single Black woman is about $100. Why is this also important? This is also important because when we talk about financial wealth building, when we talk about disposable income, when we talk about heads of households, we can't help but to notice that Black women are also in their homes in a singular capacity more often than any other community of women. So we don't have access to disposable income at a two-person household level like other people do to even put aside. You need disposable income to put into a savings account and dispose of it there, and then possibly dispose of it into the community and into the economy. We don't have that. So what comes in our household is oftentimes going out in necessities and not being able to be preserved for the longer term of our life. It will take nearly 100 years for a Black woman to reach wage parity with a white man in the US. And then furthermore, as we've heard from some of the other panelists and speakers, it will take nearly 250 years for Black people to reach economic parity with our white colleagues. So what do we do with that? Because we won't be here in 250. I don't know about you, but I won't be here in 250 years, okay? No matter how much I pray on it. So I think we can do a couple of things. Number one, we need to continue to encourage, and I'll start from the bottom to the top, at the entrepreneurial level for our young people. We need to infuse entrepreneurship across disciplines at our HBCUs and ensure that what we're teaching people is, I don't care whether you went into medical school, whether you're in the law school, whether you're in the School of Fine Arts, everybody has the ability to be an entrepreneur. If you start a medical practice, you too can be an entrepreneur. You're a medical entrepreneur. If you are an artist, you are a creative entrepreneur. And to see ourselves in that type of capacity and to start learning those things early on. Young people are excited about entrepreneurship for a multitude of reasons. Let's capitalize off of their excitement about entrepreneurship to also infuse in them early lessons on financial literacy. How and why? Because what you need to save for the business is what you need to learn to save for life, period. And so if we can start encouraging them to learn about how to do that now, it helps them in the long run. So I would say interdisciplinary entrepreneurship education should be incorporated and infused. Next, when it comes to us as adults, people say, well, where do you get money when you can't make money? We are creative people. We are also consuming people. And so I always tell people jokingly, and this is the truth, when I started one of my first companies, the first way that I was able to gain investment for my company was by selling things I had in my closet. I didn't need that Gucci bag. I didn't need this. I didn't need that. I liquidated some of my assets. You will go through your life and you should budget and see what you're wasting your money on. We are in a pandemic right now, so what we should be doing is trying to save as much of what we have and reduce our expenses. This is not the time to just be whimsically buying things because we were bored on the weekend. Let's figure out how to use that money to apply that for something else that we have as a financial and life goal that we have. Next, I also think as we're in our age, in the age range of being an adult, finding financially prudent partners. And that's not just about your relationships with your significant other, it's also about your friendships and ensuring that we infuse financial conversations into our day-to-day conversations and into our life. That is important. We need to be financially literate. And that also means that we need to be speaking the language of financial literacy and financial empowerment and holding each other up and holding each other accountable for being engaged in what it means to be financially wealth building, okay? And then lastly, I would say, from an entrepreneurial perspective, we need to infuse more capital. The truth of the matter is this: 99.95% of small businesses in the US do not receive VC. For us to only focus on the VC community all the time is really not to hold the banks and lending institutions, CDFIs, and other organizations that are responsible for the biggest majority of how loans are going to be distributed and how financial capital is going to be distributed across the nation accountable. And so I think it's important that, one, we're aware of all these financial instruments, aware of all the new financial organizations, the fintech companies that are allowing access to capital with immediacy and with immediate response. And to see those as potential solutions to some of the disparities and the discrimination that we have received when we walk into a bank and people see who we are at that point. And so I think that that's also possible. Wealth building through financial savings, financial transfer, and we need to be thinking about estate planning. You don't have to be a millionaire to think like a millionaire. Because we said estate planning does not mean that you have to have a $5 million home. And if you don't, that you can't be thinking about estate planning. Estate planning is what is the reason for the delta between Black women and white women. It's the house. I don't care whether it's built up or broke down, that one can transfer to their children and does. through things like their wills, through things like their retirement, through things like also having insurances on their home, so that when and if you ever pass, that your family is not now responsible for the debt of the home and then has to sell the house because they can't keep it. These are real conversations, again, that are a part of what I'm talking about when I say, what do we mean when we say financial literacy? We mean that we need to be speaking about finances as often as we're speaking about everything else. So those are my recommendations. And that's some of the information that I'd like to share about what I believe is the key to Black wealth, and that is to empower our entire community, and most certainly the Black woman. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for your comments. Very, very insightful. And, you know, it really highlights the fact that participation in economic opportunity is actually not enough to secure equitable opportunity to sustain a business. And we can look at, like you said, the creative history and imagination of Black people and Black women in particular to understand that you know, we are participating. There is a blueprint for change. All of you have exemplified that, but we do need to hold other institutions accountable and not just investors, like you said. So thank you for your comments. Again, I'd now like to introduce Professor Darrick Hamilton, one of the country's leading economists examining racial disparity, and he also serves as the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy, as well as the founding director of the newly created Institute for the Study of Race, Stratification, and Political Economy at the New School in New York City. The Institute will advance research, policy, and conversation regarding the iterative interactions of race, stratification, and political economy. He is a pioneer and internationally recognized scholar in the field of stratification economics, which fuses insights from multiple disciplines to challenge and expand orthodox economic interpretation as they relate to identity formation, collective group action, inequality, and group-based distributions. He's been a vocal proponent of policy solutions related to economic health and educational outcomes. Prior to joining the New School, Professor Hamilton served as the executive director of the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at The Ohio State University, and was a professor in the John Glenn College of Public Affairs with courtesy appointments in the Department of Economics, Sociology, African American Studies, and brings that knowledge and that analytical lens from a cross-disciplinary standpoint to his work. He's also serving as a member currently of the Economic Committee of the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force. He's testified before the Senate and House Joint Economic Committee on potential policy responses to COVID-19, and is a surrogate advisor for the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign. He was in the past, and he has advised numerous other members of Congress, including the following 2020 presidential candidates: Senators Cory Booker, Kristen Gillibrand, Kamala Harris, and Elizabeth Warren. And so he has the eyes and ears of many of our elected officials. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Professor Darrick Hamilton for his insights for us today.
Well, thank you. Thank you to Congressman Meeks. Thank you to Prudential for sponsoring this. Thank you to my fellow panelists. And I'd like to shout out that Minna and I are Oberlin College graduates and share the distinction of being in the Economic Department Club of Graduates as well. And thank you for that generous introduction also.
Of course.
All right, so this panel is being conducted in the backdrop of political unrest and disgust for the repeated unjust shootings and killings of Black people, and a global pandemic in which the Black mortality rate is more than double that of the white rate, and in which 45%, nearly half of Black businesses have been closed as a result of this pandemic. That the impact of something presumably random, such as a pandemic, however catastrophic, can be linked to one's racial identity, it's highly problematic and further evidence that as a nation, we are failing miserably. This links to a larger political and economic vulnerability, whether we're in a pandemic or not. The immoral devaluation of Black lives has been ingrained in America's political economy, and that has everything to do with both the racial wealth gap and the racial business gaps. Let me point out a couple of things. You know, when we think about economic justice, I think we would define it at least having access to capital and authentic agency and choice. So even when thinking about the racial business gap, we need to consider pull versus push factors. Is it business ownership as a result of not having access to labor market opportunities, the hustle economy, or is it people with authentic desires to engage in their authentic entrepreneurial spirit? We need to be cognizant of that. And then also, I want to say when given stats across groups, one group that we often exclude from the denominator altogether is those that are incarcerated. So I think we need to be aware that there is a large segment of the Black population in the context of our statistics that is literally incarcerated. And also when thinking about gender, we can't divorce people, individuals from their larger family context. So what happens to Black women obviously impacts Black men and vice versa. That said, I want to shout out Diane Stewart, who's at Emory University, and her new book that's coming out, where she describes the role of capital in facilitating relationships more broadly. That when people are properly resourced, they have better agency as it relates to relationships more broadly. And that's whether we're talking about heteronormative relationships or other types of relationships as well. The American unjust racial business gap and racial wealth gap is rooted in a history that has privileged white people with financial advantages to buy crucial, additional, and intergenerational advantages for themselves and their children. Government policy and literally government giveaways provided them with the finance, education, land, and infrastructure to accumulate and pass down wealth from one generation to the next. In contrast, Black people were largely excluded, and when they were able to accumulate land and enterprise, it was subject to government seizure, complicit theft, fraud, and terror. So there's economic and political dimensions, and shout out to my panelist, Ericka Taylor, for eloquently describing this in her talk. Our obscene concentration of wealth, especially by race, and its accompanying plutocracy, it's undemocratic, it's dysfunctional, and it's a bad depiction of power and material well-being. Our conventional wisdom has radically situated the market as a great, efficient, self-regulating, colorblind arbiter of our worth and the solution for all our problems, economic or otherwise. Stigmatization based on race and anti-Blackness, those have strategically been used as political fodder to implement harsh and punitive control on the underclass. In other words, Blacks have become the symbolism of undeserving welfare queens, deadbeat dads, and super predators by which we have defined the surplus population. They're characterized as persistently unemployed, unemployable, source of urban crime, malice, and whose subsistence needs are deemed a drain on fiscal budgets. What is glaringly missing from all that narrative is the power of capital and how power itself, along with capital, can alter the rules and structures of markets, transactions in the first place. Power and capital are self-reinforcing, and without government interventions, they generate iterative cycles of both stratification and inequality. Without capital, we lock in inequality. The ways in which wealth is generated, it is wealth itself that begets more wealth. It's not behavioral, it's not based on choice, it is capital. And if we want to end the racial wealth gap, we end racism and we end other forms of predation and exploitation, and we ensure that everyone has the capital they need to get into an asset that will passively appreciate over their lifetime. Yet, despite that, the framing of the racial wealth gap, including the use of alternative financial service products, it focuses on poor financial choices and decision-making, largely on the part of Black, Latinx, and poor borrowers. This framing is tied to a culture of poverty thesis in which Blacks are presumed to have an undervalued and low acquisition of literacy and education. The framing is wrong. The directional emphasis is wrong. It is more likely that meager economic circumstance, not poor decision-making or deficient knowledge, constrains choice itself and leaves poor borrowers with little to no other financial options but to attain and use predatory, and abusive financial services. Financial behavior and financial literacy, they are all practically useless for households with little to no finances to manage in the first place. So I'm not opposed to financial literacy, but we have to focus on the primary issue, and that is capital. All of us can be extracted from a finance industry that's well-resourced, poor, black, white, or whatever. So the key issue is capital. So we have some lessons from the Great Recession. We know that through Great Recession, inequality was made worse. And in part because asset prices become lower to purchase assets in a recession, and those that have capital are able to benefit from that, to benefit from housing insecurity, and able to get bottom feeder prices in order to generate greater inequality. And what becomes worse is if the state interventions are focused on a top as opposed to the bottom level of building up. We know we need stimulus in an economic downturn, but if we focus on humans as opposed to firms, that would be a better way to get us out of recession, but do it in a more equitable way. Millennials in the last Great Recession, that we told them to go to college to wait out the recession. We saddled them with debt, and today their record levels of home ownership disparities in a generational sense for millennials. In other words, they have the lowest rates of home ownership for similar aged generations dating all the way back to the greatest generation dating all the way back to the greatest generation when they were coming out of the Great Depression. What's more is that racial disparity in home ownership for millennials is higher than any other generation at a similar age since we've been tracking it. So what can we do about this? Well, why do we need banks as intermediaries for a lot of federal programs? We saw the impact of that from the last intervention. And you know, we could have public banks. We can have the Federal Reserve act as not just a bank for financial industries, but also work as a bank for the American people. We need to do something about credit scores. Something so important in determining someone's access should not be at the proprietary whim of a private sector without the accountability that goes along with government having a decision-making power in how we rate people, if we rate them at all. We need federal job guarantees so that if there is movement into entrepreneurship, it's not a push factor, but rather a pull factor, so that workers have viable alternatives from firms that might discriminate or might impose harsh working conditions, such as women being harassed at work, and also jobs that are dedicated towards our physical as well as human infrastructure so that we'll be more resilient to the next pandemic when it comes around. And we obviously need capital. I've talked a lot about baby bonds as a mechanism, and we can get more into details about that, but ultimately government historically has facilitated its people by providing access to capital, and we should do it again, but do it in an anti-racist, anti-sexist way, where by design and implementation, we don't exclude people based on those criteria. We need portable benefits. Your health insurance, clearly in this pandemic, shouldn't be tied to your job. We need to cancel student debt. Something like higher education should be a right in the 21st century. And we can see with millennials, we've saddled them with debt and scarred them for their life course of building assets. Cancel medical debt as well. We need accountability in federal policies, not just to whether, for example, a merger impacts market concentration, but its impact on racial equity as well. Industrial policy in America has racial dimensions, and those accountability and scoring mechanisms need to be incorporated. Finally, the biggest albatross on a progressive agenda is PAYGO itself. The notion that we don't have sovereign monetary power to invest in our most treasured resource, which is our people. Federal government is not like a household. That is a myth. And I guess I'll say no more at the risk of being partisan, given that I'm giving a talk before the CBCF. So I will stop there and just finally end on a note that, we talk about the racial wealth gap and the way we project it to go, but that's not our destiny. Inequality and despair is a political choice, and likewise, we can make a different choice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Hamilton. Always great to hear your framework and the racial equity lens you're bringing to these issues, and definitely appreciate how we ought to be preparing the next generation of our young people who are going to be inheriting really egregious disparities. And again, it goes back to education too. What are we doing to set them up for success? I mean, we can only look at, I often remind people, look at the unemployment rate of teenagers. It's always striking that it's in the double digits. That's very scary for people who are paying tuition at the same time banking on their education for financial wealth, you know, and gainful employment. So thank you, as always, for your insightful analysis. And with that, last but not least, I'd like to introduce all of you, someone who is not unfamiliar to you, Dr. Julianne Malveaux. She is a longtime recognized progressive labor economist who is nationally renowned, noted author, and astute commentator. Dr. Malveaux has been described by Dr. Cornel West as the most iconoclastic public intellectual in the country. I couldn't agree. Her contributions to the public dialogue on issues such as race, culture, gender, and their economic impacts are shaping public opinion in the 21st century. Dr. Malveaux's popular writing has appeared in USA Today, Black Issues in Higher Education, Miss Magazine, Essence, and The Progressive. Her weekly columns appeared for more than a decade in newspapers across the country, including the Los Angeles Times, Charlotte Observer, New Orleans Tribune, Detroit Free Press, and the San Francisco Examiner. She has hosted television and radio programs, appeared widely as a commentator on networks, including CNN, BET, PBS, NBC, ABC, Fox News, MSNBC, you name it, she's been part of that conversation. She also serves as the honorary co-chair of the Social Action Commission of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, and currently serves on the board of the Economic Policy Institute. Many of you will also remember she served as the 15th president of Bennett College for Women, and her most recent book, entitled Are We Better Off? Race, Obama, and Public Policy, gives insightful analysis on President Obama's 8 years in office. She is a powerful voice of analysis, respected across the nation for her unapologetic realism and long track record of advocating for equitable economic reform. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Julianne Malveaux.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Minna. Some of you may know Minna was my mentee through the Congressional Black Caucus internship program, and I just adore her. I did not know that she and Darrick, who I also think the world of, had the Oberlin connection. And I just really want to shout out all of the panelists because they brought great dimensions to a conversation about wealth. The first thing that I want to say is that financial literacy is not public policy. I mean, financial literacy is important, and I'm grateful to Prudential for their sponsorship, but financial literacy is not public policy. And so we can, and many people have, scolded Black people because we don't save enough, scolded Black people because we don't work hard enough, scolded Black people because we don't do enough, without looking at the ways that public policy has systematically robbed Black people of wealth. I mean, systematically. At the end of the Civil War, there was $1 Black dollar for every 36 white dollars. Today, it's like $1 Black dollar for every 10 white dollars. We went down actually most between 1870 and 1890, when Black people, absent the evil of white folks' craziness, there's another way to call this, but many of you know, I'm not at my most eloquent today. So white folks' craziness, absent that, we essentially lost money. Reconstruction, Jim Crow laws, et cetera, prevented us from owning, prevented us from accumulating, and all of that. So we have to deal with that. We have to talk about it. Sister talked about the Tulsa, Oklahoma, but we have to talk about the whole Red Summer of 1919 and that which followed that. There were more than 34 actions against Black people that robbed them of property because white folks were just envious. They could not fathom that Black people could have more than them. A Black man was lynched because he owned a car. Another Black man was lynched because he had an orange grove. People would, when I tell these stories, people feel crazy, which I am, but that's another story. But the fact is that systematically, African-American wealth was essentially minimized. We could look at any number of things. I think either Darrick or my sister with the Wall Street Group mentioned the ways that the Homestead Act excluded us. So we're sidelined from the possibility of owning. We're sidelined for any number of possibilities. And we haven't even begun to calculate that sidelining. There's a book called Sundown Towns that talks about the more than 2,000 towns where Black people would just run off their property because white people, you know, were crazy. There's another way to put this, but let's just call it crazy. I mean, we had Black people who owned and they had to leave their property overnight because of sundown towns. So while I think it's extraordinarily important for us to talk about good financial strategies, I think it's also important for us to talk about, as Darrick says, the issue of capital and the issue of exclusion. And that's really where we must begin. HR 40 is sitting there. This is a thing there. And I would say, my sister from Prudential, that any responsible corporate organization that believes in equality must support HR 40. That HR 40 is really about looking at what we lost and how we can regain it. I mean, I think it's just critically important. We can talk about the wealth gap, we can talk about the numbers. I mean, y'all know I'm a numbers person, but we must talk about the foundational ways that Black people were systematically robbed because people were able to thingify us. And this is the word of Dr. King, thingify us. So you thingify us, you make us less than a person. So you make us less than a person, you can treat us any kind of way. You can even treat your children who you had by a slave woman any kind of way because you had thingified us. So the thingification of Black people is at the root of our nation's capitalism. The ability to sideline Black people is at the root of our nation's capitalism, and we must do something about it. So I could go through history. I got my little list here of all the things that were done. Wage lists, of course, from enslavement, Jim Crow, sharecropping, the labor contracts that Black people newly freed were forced to sign, which meant that you could, if you walked off somebody's plantation, you could be jailed and then treated as free labor, excuse me. I get agitated when I think about this stuff. I mean, I get highly agitated because, you know, I became an economist because I wanted to know why Black people had less. Literally, that was the question that my 15-year-old girl wanted to know. Why do Black people have less? My mom and them wanted me to be a teacher, a school teacher, because that's what Black women did. But I want to know why we had less. And you start playing with the numbers and you understand how we have been systematically robbed and how our nation has never been held accountable for the ways that we've been systematically robbed. So while we can talk about, you know, wealth creation in the context of saving more money, as Natalie did, or starting more businesses, the fact is that it won't be equal until our nation actually comes to grips with the crime that it has systematically committed against our people. Redlining, we can talk about that. I mean, we lost a lot, of course, in a Great Recession, but we've been losing a lot all before that. In my own family, we have the story of the moving fence. In Moss Point, Mississippi, we owned some land. It had a little bio at the end of it, which people like to go down to and fish. We weren't selfish about it. We let white folks, Black folks, anybody go down and fish. But one day the fence moved. Like the fence moved. Like they went to bed, they woke up, the fence had moved. Years later, they named the lane Hawkins Lane after my great-great-grandmother, but the fence moved. They just took our stuff. But this is not a unique story. This is not a Malvo story. This is a story that happened to Black people all over the country. So we must own that story. As you know, last year, June 19th, 2019, I testified at the HR 40 hearing about reparations. It was very fascinating. The Congress people were very interested in asking Danny Glover, who's my fellow commissioner on NARC, National African American Reparations Commission, about his movie career, because they did not want to talk to an economist about the real deal. But what we must know is that it's the economics that are at the bottom of this. And so I applaud Congressman Meeks and his service on the Financial Services Committee, Maxine Waters, who has always been there in terms of these issues going back to the bank fraud back in the 80s. They've been there and they've done everything they can. But what has to be dealt with is the structure, the institutional structure, and the ways that our people have been robbed. There will not be justice until there is equality. There will not be equality until there are reparations. We can tell Black people to save more money. We can tell Black people to start more businesses. We can have lovely companies like Prudential, and we do appreciate you, so I'm not being ugly, but we can tell lovely companies to invest their $400+ million in our communities. But structurally, what we must do is talk about how to make it right. And the only way you make it right is with reparations. The only way you make it right is with deliberately closing the gap. I mean, you know, Mena, I live off of 14th Street in DC. You've been around my house. I live in Gentrification Central. And if you walk down Gentrification Central, you see all these signs that say Black Lives Matter. These are companies that have not hired any Black people, you know, that are mean to Black people when they come into their stores, but they got signs up that say Black Lives Matter. That's called, I don't want you to break my window insurance. But in any case, what I'm saying about that is that anybody who is conscious in this country must make a commitment to equality and to economic equity. And that means making a commitment. Darrick laid it out in terms of jobs and other things, but it's even more than that. It's basically dealing with the wealth gap frontally. So anytime I see these ads with these cute little white girls hugging up on each other and they're the Black Lives Matter, that ain't gonna get it. What's gonna get it is basically consciously deciding that we want to close the wealth gap and make opportunities available for everyone. So I think I probably talked too long. I probably talked too passionately, but y'all know me. That would be me. I really feel strongly, like I said, I recall vividly being that little 15-year-old Black girl and turning a paper in. I used Black construction paper and white chalk and said, equality, ? And the teacher sent me home with it and said, this is not appropriate. So my mother had to go back to the school and fuss out the teacher. I came by it honest, y'all. Fuss out the teacher and say, she can present her paper any way she wants to. Well, I got an A- on it because of the black chalk and whatever. But the fact is that this has been my passion my whole life. And this must be our nation's passion to make it right for Black folks.
Thank you, Dr. Malvo. Appreciate that. And thank you for keeping it real. I want to just open up the panel. We got a chance to hear from all of our expert panelists. Thank you very much. We have 10 minutes to sort of synthesize our thoughts. So I just want to ask a question about the current moment we're in, because there are some dual realities going on right now. And how do we measure the bar in terms of addressing some of the solutions you all proposed, whether it's a federal jobs guarantee, whether it's HR 40, as you mentioned, you testify. How long has Conyers been waiting for that day, right? Do you all believe, maybe in an ironic sense or not, that in the current political context, we actually have a shot at moving HR 40 along, at moving baby bonds along? Is it harder or relatively easier, given the current moment we're in, to actually start holding our government officials accountable, our financial institutions accountable, and really moving the needle forward on some of the things you all discussed that would never have been really even discussed in the ways that they have been raised currently? Any thoughts?
You know, the answer is November 3rd. And I know we're nonpartisan, non-whatever, but let's just make it real. The answer is November 3rd. We could go backward or we could go forward. And that's the answer. We have extreme voter suppression. We have a takeover of the post office. We have, I'm not supposed to call them what I'm going to call them, so I'm not going to call them that. Y'all can just use your imagination. But the fact is that we have a government that for Black people is going backwards. So the answer for us is that any hope of HR 40, if there's any hope of canceling tuition, if there's any hope of the survival of our HBCUs, which right now is imperiled, it is on November 3rd. And folks, you know, 1, 2, you know what to do.
Right. Ericka, you were going to say something?
Oh, actually, yes, and I do. I absolutely agree. That's really critical. But I also have some slivers of hope from the fact that we have over a dozen municipalities are defunding and reassessing how they fund police systems now, right? So I think that we are in this moment where I am much more optimistic on the local level, and I think sort of historically, a lot locally is where a lot of the sort of the meat and potatoes, where the work happens, and that's less and less the case when you have sort of major traumas like you have now. So like from the trauma of slavery and the need for reparations to the pandemic and having this, and then the recession. So those are moments where the federal is the purpose of the federal government and its utility becomes even greater. And with that, I have to have to echo Dr. Malveaux. Yes, what hope looks like will be much more apparent. And 3 months from now, I'll have a much clearer answer to that.
Great. I'm going to have Celine jump in, and then Professor Hamilton will end with your comments, because I want you to bring us up to the current political context, given your interactions with a lot of our policymakers, how real we can, it is for us to move on these issues. So President Celine, any comments on your end to close out?
Yes, and thank you to our esteemed panelists. Your oratory skills today and bringing us to the reality of what we're facing are quite sharp. So appreciate all your comments, and happy to be in that small space here of what organizations like Prudential can do. So to build on what Ericka was just saying, local is really important. I think the election in the fall is going to do what it's going to do, but there's a lot of local effort and initiative that you can think about to actually pull things forward. So a couple things. In Newark, for example, dealing with affordable housing and trying to deal with the issue of gentrification, there's an equitable growth commission that Prudential helped to start to actually bring accountability to those issues and make sure everybody participates and that you can pull things forward. How do you support better public education? The Newark Trust for Education was created to help build bridges. I mean, there are going to be and will continue to be strong local community efforts, right, that I think we all have to stay attuned to as well. These national issues are critical, but I always like to say we don't know what people are going to do, but we do know what we can do.
Great. Thank you. On that note, I want to turn it over to Professor Hamilton for your closing remarks. Are we getting closer to the realities of making some of these policy changes that you've been advocating for so long?
And let's think about this in context. We've had over 45 years of growing disparity. So all of America's productivity going to the elite, while real wages have remained the same. Wealth disparity across the board getting larger, the top 0.1% having more of the nation's resources in terms of wealth than the bottom 90%. So that has facilitated, in my view, a vulnerability to authoritarian rule. A vulnerability to what we saw at the Republican National Convention on a Tuesday, where we literally had the convention taking place at the White House. So this was a political event used on a government, with the nation's government at use in its disposal, with a Secretary of State beaming from Jerusalem while he's on duty. So that is authoritarian rule. We had the First Lady in Army fatigues at the White House in the Rose Garden delivering a political speech. That vulnerability is the result of 45 years of despair, that type of leadership can come to office. One is able to stoke divisiveness and racial fears with growing inequality. Unfortunately, people not only care about their absolute position, they care about their relative position. So the property rights and whiteness become more salient when there's growing inequality. And a nation can be captured in that way. So that is the vulnerability. The good news is that younger generations are pushing back. Younger generations are now demanding justice, redefining economic good to get beyond self-interested value where accumulation knows no bounds, to start talking about how we value common humanity, how we value dignity, and how we value sustainability. When we define economics in those terms, and moral terms, then there is that possibility of a change towards shared economy, a shared prosperity economy from an economic and political sense. So to drive it home, the question of can we do something about in this political moment to really promote economic justice? You know, FDR said this famous quote that people don't cite enough when he told the progressive people, make me do it. So regardless of who's president, if this is the society we want, make them do it. Let's make our social movements, make them do it. And like Julianne, I'm committed to justice irrespective of economic conditions, irrespective of political conditions. I'm committed to it as a matter of faith. So regardless of what time period we're in, right is right, and that's why we should commit to it, and that should be enough. And reparations, if we're ever going to get to racial justice, I wholeheartedly agree, the nation has to grapple with, take atonement and ownership for what they've done, and then provide some redress so that we as a nation can heal and get rid of these narratives that define inequality as the root of deficiencies of poor people. And the best place to start is with Black people themselves.
Thank you. Professor Hamilton, a great way to end, and I want to thank you all for the work you do. You know, we have a lot ahead of us, and we encourage everyone to be civically engaged. Your vote is your voice, and we also thank Prudential Financial for supporting this panel. Thank you to Celine Hitchcock-Gear, Ericka Taylor, Professor Hamilton, Dr. Julianne Malveaux, and Ms. Natalie Cofield. We appreciate the work that you do to lift up our communities. Thank you so much. And to all those tuning in, you can learn more about this conference and the work they're doing. Come to our website at www.cbcfinc.org. And with that, we will conclude. So thank you so much to our panelists.
Thank you, Mena.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.